With the generator housing installed, I'm turning my attention to what skoolie project I should be working on next. There are a lot of contenders for that, removing the panels on the walls in preparation for framing and adding insulation, removing some parts of the floor in preparation for filling holes and putting a finished floor down. It's still too cold to apply sealants, glues, finishes, so that affects the decision about what to do next. I'm turning my attention to the ceiling because the ceiling on the inside, the roof on the outside, seems in fact to be a location for some interlocking issues. I need to remove these panels so I can remove the, I presume, fiberglass insulation, so I can put in wooden blocks that will support the finished ceiling surface after insulation is sprayed in. But it occurs to me that before I have insulation sprayed in, I ought to make any holes in the roof of the bus that I'm going to be making. It will never be easier. That includes holes that I will need to make to attach the solar panels. It may include an exhaust vent for the gray tank. It may include an antenna for boosting cell phone reception. And in addition to acknowledging that I need to install these, I also need to determine the layout with enough certainty to know where I'm going to be installing these. So I haven't sorted all that out yet, but I do know that it's a necessary step to remove a zillion Phillips head screws so I can pull these panels down. So I'm going to start with that. I'm not sure what material the existing insulation is made of, but if the material is fiberglass, there's a risk that fibers will flake off of it when it's disturbed, which if it gets into your lungs doesn't come out again. So it's best to wear a mask when you're removing this insulation. When in doubt, wear a mask. But I later called the factory and learned that the insulation is just polyester fiber. I'm going to repurpose a lot of it for use in thermal curtains. I really can't put it off any longer. I'm going to be removing a ceiling panel that includes the frame for the emergency exit. So I've got to figure out a way to do that without messing with the interlock that causes this thing to buzz. That went easier than I expected. I believe I can save for another day the disabling of the interlock that causes a buzzer to buzz. I am going to have to remove these wire raceways in order to get the panels off because these sit on top of them. I have found that even using good quality Phillips head bits instead of the crap ones I used previously, while most of the screws come out without a problem, for some of them the head is buggered and the screwdriver bit just spins in them. Maybe they got buggered on the way in, that when installed the bit spun inside and rounded them over, but these are going to have to be removed by other means. There's another one buggered up. There are a couple things to keep an eye on when removing a ceiling panel. One is to make sure the edge doesn't cut into any of these bundles of wires. And here's an observation. The panel appears to be glued along this surface, so that'll need to be pried out. Before I came up with the technique to use the grinder to cut a slot in a stuck screw, I was just grinding the head off the screw, but that leaves the shaft. I think it will make my life easier down the road if I grind that down flush. That's better, nice and smooth. I don't plan to use these speaker wires, but I don't want to confuse them with wires, for example, driving the lights. So I'm going to coil up these wires and label them until I figure out where I should terminate them. I've decided it's sufficient just to clip them and label them. It may be that this whole bundle of wires is speakers running down the length of the bus. It's just too soon for me to say that. I'm not worried about these wires shorting together because they're not connected to the starter battery. Indeed, I think the sound signal would come from a device down here in the dashboard that I've already removed. I can now get a closer look at the wiring for the interlock associated with this emergency hatch. It appears to consist of two wires, one attached to ground and a second wire. What I need to determine is whether these two normally are shorted together and the circuit opens, setting off the alarm, or whether they're normally open and the alarm goes off when they're shorted together. Once I determine which that is, I can then just replicate that status independent of the switch in here. Here's the approach I'm going to try. I'm going to start up the engine and then cut this wire and see what happens. Significantly, I've got the bus parked in the place it's allowed to be, so if I did anything to render the bus so it can't start, I don't have to be in a panic about moving the bus till I get it sorted. So let's check it out. Well, that didn't change anything. The next test is to see whether, if I ground this wire, it has an effect. I've stripped off some insulation. Yes. The takeaway then is that we want to make sure that this wire is not grounded. It can be traced back to here, where presumably it links up with the rear escape hatch and possibly both emergency windows. I now have 3 ceiling panels down. The next one I'll be removing has ceiling lights in it. They are, of course, powered by the bus's starter battery and alternator. While of course it's nice to have overhead lights in a bus, you wouldn't want to inadvertently leave these on and run down the starter battery so you can't start the bus. So I'm going to be removing these and capping the wires. When I later install overhead lights, they will be powered by the house batteries. There's kind of a nice retro vibe to these lights, and I imagine I could get an LED equivalent to replace this incandescent light so as to draw less power. So I'm kind of on the fence about whether these will have a role in the final build. I think I'll hang on to the parts. In any row, there are 61 screws that need to be removed. I'm so grateful they're not rivets. But despite my best efforts, I believe there are 6 screws with buggered heads that I cannot remove with the power screwdriver. I'm going to have to use the grinder to grind a slot into them and remove them that way. I've been beavering away and now have 5 ceiling panels down. Here's something worth noting. On this side of the bus are a bundle of wires, some of which you won't need in your final build, some of which you absolutely will. And when a ceiling panel finally comes down, it comes down heavily, and it's a relatively sharp edge. And I managed, despite going to some effort not to nick the insulation in this yellow and green wire. I'm just going to put some tape around it and carry on, but you should do your best to protect these wires when the panel is coming down. I must say it was a surprise to see the tip of this screw bit broken off. Fortunately, I have some spares. Well, this was an ingenious place to put a hive. hopefully a defunct one, because I'm going to be poking it with a stick. I have yet to remove the 2 perforated ceiling panels near the front of the bus, but I've pretty well removed the rest of them. The rearmost panel is considerably wider than the rest of them. And there still remains this panel. I'm not sure what holds it in place. It now appears that this remaining ceiling piece and this rear wall piece are one, which means I'll either be removing all these screws here to remove the rear wall piece, or I will be using a grinder to separate the wall piece from the ceiling piece. It's late in the day, so that decision I'm going to leave for another time. It's mid-March 2022. I recently had occasion to try to add up in my mind how many things I had permanently installed in the bus since I started the conversion in earnest about last November. And the count stopped at 2, the pair of speakers behind me and the generator housing installed in the back of the bus. That's a fairly discouraging number. Today I'm going to double that amount in perhaps the most trivial way possible. These are transponders. This one is associated with EasyPass, which is a system in New York State that automates the process of paying for toll bridges and toll roads. And this is a transponder associated with the ETR 407 toll road in Ontario. In fact, for vehicles as heavy as this bus, it's not an option to use a transponder on that toll road. It's mandatory. I don't know that I'm going to have an occasion urgently to use either of these, but I wanted to have them in case the need arose. They both get affixed to the windshield. I'm resigned to the conclusion that this rearmost ceiling panel is attached to this rear wall, and so I will have to be removing at least this row of screws, and I'm not sure of the extent to which this wall was implicated. I'll just have to start removing screws and see where it gets me. Well, I've made a good deal of progress in removing screws, but there are no fewer than 10 that are buggered that are going to need the grinder treatment. I have now removed all the screws along the back wall, and I'm about to learn if any others are implicated in holding this whole thing in. It occurs to me that removing one or both of these access panel covers will give me a good handhold to tug on this thing. Well, the piece did not budge despite removing all the screws in the back and loosening this set here. So I kind of get fed up and switch to plan B, which is to take the grinder and try to separate the back piece from the ceiling piece. The exploration continues. I have removed this panel from here, but I believe it's the case that this black piece here is the same as the back wall, just bent over. I don't want to disturb the back wall because I don't want to disturb the window, amongst other things. If I'm right that the black and the gray here are just one piece bent over, then I may just take the grinder and cut the black down and screw this back down. And here's the answer. This upper gray panel is separate from the wall. When I remove its mate on this side, I should be able to get this piece out. I had imagined that there were big, 5-inch diameter holes cut through the sheet metal to accommodate the upper lights. It's encouraging to see that isn't so, since I expect I'll be removing them. There are these sheet metal screws, and these holes that I'll have to patch, but that's less ambitious an undertaking. It's hopefully the last day of ceiling removal, which I've spread over several days. The panels that remain are the two perforated ones at the front. I think this is a day for some more irrevocable steps. This table and sink I put in when I was readying the bus to be reclassified as a motorhome. I left one seat in so I could give family and friends a ride. Left this in because it held up a convenient handle. But it'll be easier to access the ceiling panels if these are removed, and I actually need the space that I'll recover when I get rid of that beat up table and sink. So I think they have to go today. I'm under the bus now. A technique I've used successfully in removing a bunch of other seats is to clamp vice grips onto the nut on the underside here, except when they're inaccessible because, for example, they're over the fuel tank. This one's a little hard to reach, but I think I can do it. I managed to get the vice grips clamped on. Let's see if will hold once I start turning up above. The bolt comes free, that means that I've succeeded. If it just keeps spinning, that means that the vice grips fell off. Back in a minute while I clamp them back on. Let's see if that helped. There'll be a gratifying thump when the vice grips hit the ground or another part of the bus. There it is. Just two more to go in the front there. And that's the last of the four. By comparison, the ones attached to the rail where you can access both the head and the nut are pretty trivial to remove. You have to lift this seat up to access one nut and bolt to remove the seat from the seat rail, and to do that you have to turn a handle here. In fact, it may already be in position. Let's try. There we go, and there's the remaining one to remove. Well, the seat is removed, but I can't actually get it out of the way until I make a run to the dump. I've looked under the bus for the nuts corresponding to these two bolts, but they don't appear to be accessible for me to get a clamp on them. So these are going to have to come off using the grinder. The handle is affixed at the top with ordinary Phillips head screws, but at the bottom it appears to be riveted in place, which means I'll be using the grinder yet again. Of the three fasteners that I have to remove to get this piece out, it turns out one could be removed completely from up here because it didn't have a nut below. These two appear to have a nut below. With the grinder, those heads came off quite easily. Well, I ground off the last of the bolt heads, and I can finally see the back of the driver's seat. I could never recline it quite as much as I'd liked, and perhaps with that unit out of the way I'll be able to do it. I've got almost all the screws out of the first of the two perforated panels and started to remove it, but it appears that there are a couple of places where it has been riveted into place and not just screwed. So I'm putting some screws back on either side of where the rivet is and going to take the grinder and get rid of the rivet. Grinding off those rivet heads worked. That's one of the two perforated panels down. I knew there was an overhead fresh air vent. Here it is revealed. I see the stamped sheet metal forming the roof has been bent upward, so capping this is going to be a bit of a challenge. On the driver's side is welded in this relatively heavy panel with 4 sets of threads cut into it here where the seatbelt is attached. That's my first priority after taking the perforated sheet down, to reinstall the seatbelt. There are quite a number of screws implicated in the frontmost perforated panel. Amongst other things, I had to remove the fan and the raceway that hides a bunch of wires. I've got almost all the screws out, and we'll see how it goes. Well, the last ceiling panel is out. I'm a bit concerned about some surface rust that I see here. I'm not sure where the moisture would come from. I suppose I can't rule out condensation. I'm sure I'll be in the bus in the rain before this gets covered up, and I'll be able to observe firsthand if any rain is coming in. So that's it. All the ceiling panels are out. You can see where I chose to stop when moving forward, and I'm aware of the fact that a lot of skoolie owners tear this front sheet metal out completely and put in storage, bookcases, what have you. But the pneumatic mechanism that operates the swinging front doors is located here. Also located here are the motors for the windshield wipers on the left and on the right. And it's a place where I store some emergency equipment. So for now, I'm not going to be tearing this out. I also will likely want to keep indicators of its former role as a school bus, such as this sign, and the label affixed by the manufacturer. I may try to match the paint and do a touch-up though.